Welcome. Thank you for your service to our two distinguished witnesses. You know, back in 1991, tens of thousands of Kurds fleeing Saddam Hussein traveled to the Turkish border. They were blocked from gaining entry. President George Herbert Walker Bush initiated Operation Provide Comfort, largely organized out of Incirlik. It provided massive amounts of food, clothing, and shelter. U.S. Special Forces saved probably thousands, certainly hundreds from exposure and sickness before the NGOs could kick in. I traveled with a group of members to the border back then. Biggest takeaway, the Turks absolutely refused to help men, women, and innocent children. And secondly, they were seething with animosity towards the Kurds. Now, I'm telling you something that you already know. Most people, I think, know it as well. But I was struck by that animosity. Remind me of the hatred they had for the Armenians that led to the Armenian genocide. It was just seething. One man took a meal ready to eat, MRE, from a pallet left there by our government, by our military, and they shot him in cold blood the day after we left. Fast forward to now, when given the opportunity, they will seize it. So I have a couple of questions. My good colleagues before me had asked many of the questions that I have. But frankly, I'd like to ask about the use of white phosphorus, a terrible, terrible chemical agent. When it's used for camouflage, it's one thing. When it's used to kill innocent people, and there's at least some indications that it's been used against at least 6 people who inhaled it. The Red Crescent for the Kurdish Red Crescent said 6 patients with burns are watching. If so, this is a war crime. I wonder what you could tell us about that. On sanctions, you know, the PACT Act and a bill as well introduced by Liz Cheney makes clear that we want sanctions. One goes further and says even Erdogan should be sanctioned. But there was the sanctions put out by the president, Executive Order 13894. If you could speak to that, how well that's being implemented, which went after the defense minister and the interior minister. It ought to go right to the top, I would respectfully submit. Erbil, I've been to Erbil. I know the Kurds there and the Christian and Yazidis who fled, obviously, for their lives from ISIS. They've been very much concerned about an incursion there. Your thoughts on what happens there? Again, if you could speak to this use of weapons. And finally, in both bills, the chairman's bill, and Mr. McCall, of course, is the lead Republican sponsor. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor as well. Also talks about denying military assistance to Turkey. Both bills do it. Do you think that's a prudent act? We all remember back in '74 when the Turks went into Cyprus. They used our material, what we provided, to suppress Cyprus and to kill many. We ought to hold them to account, and I do hope Section 4 of both bills has that sanctions on providing any kind of military assistance to Turkey. Your thoughts on that?
On the white phosphorus, we have seen one report of the use of white phosphorus. We're looking into that. White phosphorus is tricky because, as you indicated, it has military uses, and you have to almost determine not what happened, but what the intent was. But as I said, we're looking into that. There was only one incident of that, I believe. In terms of the sanctions that we imposed on 3 ministers and 2 ministries on the 14th of October, on the basis of the executive order that was published that day for serious sanctions because of the incursion. We started implementing it immediately. As part of the agreement with Turkey on the 17th of October, last Thursday, we agreed not to impose any new sanctions under that executive order. And based upon the fact that the Turks have declared, in accordance with our agreement, that their offensive is over, what they call Peace Spring, as of last night, we're about, I believe, to lift those sanctions. But I want to underline, the sanction executive order remains in place. We can, just as quick as we did last time, impose new sanctions under that executive order if we're not happy with the behavior of the Turks or anybody else that is covered in that very, very broad and very, very powerful sanctions instrument. In terms of congressional sanctions, again, there are a number of them out there. I saw how helpful they were in getting the Turks to a ceasefire. But I have to say that we would want to look at these very, very carefully for 2 reasons. First of all, we are concerned about very important military relations and very positive ones that we do have with Turkey. And secondly, as a general rule, we see sanctions as incentives to change behavior, which means that there has to be waivers or other presidential decision-making involved, executive branch involved in such sanctions. If there are no waivers, if it is absolute, even when the behavior is changed, it is often very hard to get these things lifted, and then we have the worst of two worlds. We don't get the behavior changed, and we're punishing people that in other places and on other issues we want to work with.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.